The rain fell in sheets across the lower sectors of Novara Prime, a sprawling metropolis that stretched across 3 continents and reached toward the stars with gleaming spires that pierced the cloud cover. But down here, in what the locals called the shadow districts, the rain was tainted with industrial runoff, leaving oily streaks across the crumbling infrastructure and pooling in puddles that reflected the flickering neon signs advertising questionable services in a dozen different languages. Torren Vasquez pulled his worn jacket tighter against the cold as he navigated the narrow alleyways between abandoned manufacturing facilities. At 32 years old, he'd spent the last decade working as a maintenance technician in the mid-levels, a job that barely paid enough to keep his small apartment and put food on the table. His dark hair was perpetually disheveled, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who worked with machinery for a living. Tonight, like most nights, he was cutting through the shadow districts on his way home from a double shift, too exhausted to take the longer but safer route through the commercial zones. The year was 2287, and humanity had spread across the stars, establishing colonies on dozens of worlds and forming alliances, sometimes uneasy ones, with various alien civilizations. Novara Prime had become a hub of interstellar commerce, a place where beings from countless species mingled in pursuit of opportunity, survival, or simply a fresh start. The upper levels of the city gleamed with the wealth generated by trade agreements and technological innovations, while the lower levels festered with poverty, desperation, and the forgotten. Torren had just passed a cluster of makeshift shelters constructed from discarded shipping containers when he heard it, a soft, pained sound that cut through the steady drumming of rain. He paused, his engineer's instincts making him alert to anything out of the ordinary. There it was again, coming from behind a stack of rusted metal panels, leaning against what had once been a warehouse wall. He approached cautiously, his boots splashing through puddles that reeked of chemicals. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. Huddled in the narrow space between the panels and the wall was a small figure, no more than 7 or 8 years old by human standards. But this was no human child. The girl's skin had a faint, iridescent quality, shifting between pale blue and silver depending on how the sparse light hit it. Her hair, matted and dirty as it was, held an almost luminescent white quality, and her eyes, when she finally looked up at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, were a striking violet that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom despite her apparent youth. She was unmistakably Etherian, one of the rarest and most enigmatic species in the known galaxy. Etherians were known throughout the civilized worlds for their longevity, their advanced mental capabilities, and their strict adherence to complex social hierarchies. They rarely ventured far from their homeworld of Ethel, and when they did, it was usually as diplomats or scholars. To find one here, alone and clearly in distress, was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented. The child was painfully thin, her clothing little more than tattered rags that had once been fine fabric. Her lips had taken on a greyish tint that Torren's limited knowledge of Etherian physiology told him indicated severe malnutrition. She was shivering, though whether from cold, hunger, or fear, he couldn't tell. "Hey there," Torren said softly, crouching down to make himself less threatening. He kept his hands visible and his movements slow. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Torren. Do you understand me?" The girl's violet eyes studied him for a long moment before she gave the smallest of nods. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, speaking in heavily accented but comprehensible standard galactic. Hungry. That single word broke something in Torren's chest. He'd seen plenty of suffering in the shadow districts. It was impossible to avoid. But there was something about this particular child, alone and so far from anything resembling home, that struck him deeply. Without thinking about the implications or the complications, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Okay," he said gently. "I can help with that. Will you come with me? I promise I'll keep you safe." The girl hesitated. and Torin could see the war playing out behind her eyes, the desperation of her circumstances, fighting against whatever warnings she'd been given about trusting strangers. Finally, necessity won out. She gave another small nod. Torin carefully helped her to her feet, noting how light she was, how fragile she felt despite the subtle strength in Etherean bone structure. He shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, where it hung like a blanket. Then, as gently as he could, he lifted her into his arms. The walk back to his apartment took twice as long as usual, partly because Torin was being careful with his precious cargo, and partly because he was trying to figure out what exactly he'd just gotten himself into. The girl rested her head against his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling gradually subsiding as his body heat warmed her. His apartment was located in one of the mid-level residential blocks, a far cry from both the glittering penthouses of the upper city and the desperate squalor of the shadow districts. It was small, just a main room that served as both living area and kitchen, a tiny bedroom and a bathroom that had seen better days, but it was clean and, more importantly, it was warm. Once inside, Torin set the girl down on his worn couch and immediately went to the kitchen area. He didn't have much in the way of food, but he quickly heated some nutrient broth that was supposed to be compatible with most carbon-based life forms, according to the label. While it warmed, he grabbed a blanket from his bedroom and wrapped it around the shivering child. "Here," he said, handing her a mug of the warm broth. "Drink this slowly. Your stomach's probably not ready for anything heavy." The girl took the mug with both hands, her fingers longer and more delicate than human fingers, wrapping around the warm ceramic. She sipped cautiously at first, then with more enthusiasm as the warmth spread through her. Torin watched, making sure she didn't drink too quickly, and felt a small measure of relief as some color began to return to her features. "What's your name?" he asked after she'd finished about half the mug. The girl looked at him, those violet eyes seeming to measure him, to assess whether he could be trusted with something as precious as a name. Finally, she spoke. "Lyra." "Lyra?" Torin repeated, offering a gentle smile. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me how you ended up in the shadow districts? Where are your parents?" At the mention of parents, Lyra's expression crumpled, and tears began to stream down her iridescent cheeks. She shook her head violently, unable or unwilling to speak. Torin immediately felt guilty for pushing. "It's okay," he said quickly. "You don't have to talk about it. You're safe now. That's what matters." But even as he said the words, Torin knew that safe was a relative term. He had no idea what circumstances had brought an Etherean child to Novara Prime, but he knew enough about galactic politics to understand that it was probably complicated and potentially dangerous. The responsible thing to do would be to contact the authorities, to report finding her, and let the proper channels handle it. Yet something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Lyra had looked at him with such desperate hope when he'd offered to help. Maybe it was the knowledge that the proper channels on Novara Prime were notoriously corrupt and indifferent to the suffering of those who couldn't pay for their attention. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in years, he felt like he could make a real difference in someone's life. "You can stay here tonight," he told Lyra. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow. Right now, you need rest." He gave her his bedroom while he made do with the couch, despite her weak protests. As he lay there in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the city and the occasional sound of Lyra shifting in the next room, Torin wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He had no experience with children, alien or otherwise. He barely made enough to support himself, let alone another person. And if anyone found out he was harboring an unregistered alien, especially one as unusual as an Etherean child, the consequences could be severe. But when morning came, and he found Lyra standing in the doorway of the bedroom, looking small and lost and hopeful all at once, he knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. Because in that moment, looking at this child who had no one else, Torin Vasquez decided he was going to be the person she needed him to be. 3 months passed, and Torin's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The initial days were the hardest, figuring out what an Etherian child needed to eat, learning about their unique physiology, and establishing some kind of routine that would work for both of them. He'd spent hours searching through galactic databases during his breaks at work, trying to find information about Etherian dietary requirements and developmental stages, all while being careful not to trigger any monitoring algorithms that might flag his searches as suspicious. Lyra proved to be remarkably resilient. Within a week of regular meals and a safe place to sleep, the greyish tint had left her lips, and her iridescent skin had begun to glow with a healthy luster. She was quiet most of the time, speaking only when necessary, but Torin could see her gradually relaxing, the constant tension in her small shoulders easing as she began to trust that this shelter wasn't temporary, that he wasn't going to abandon her. He'd had to make adjustments to his life and his apartment. The bedroom became hers permanently, and he'd used most of his savings to buy a proper bed and some clothes that would fit her. He'd also invested in a food synthesizer capable of producing the mineral-rich compounds that Etherians needed to supplement their diet. It had cost him 2 months' salary, but seeing Lyra's eyes light up when he presented her with a properly balanced meal made every credit worth it. Work became more challenging. Torin had to carefully balance his shifts to ensure Lyra was never alone for too long, which meant turning down overtime opportunities he desperately needed. He'd told his co-workers that he was caring for a distant relative, which wasn't entirely false if you were generous with your definition of distant and relative. Most of them were too wrapped up in their own struggles to ask many questions. The biggest challenge was keeping Lyra hidden. Novara Prime had strict registration requirements for all residents, especially non-humans, and failure to comply could result in deportation or imprisonment. Torin had considered trying to forge documents, but the penalties for that were even worse. So instead, they lived quietly, Lyra rarely venturing beyond the apartment, and Torin living with the constant low-grade anxiety that someone would discover his secret. But there were moments, increasingly frequent moments, when the difficulties faded into the background, replaced by something Torin had never expected to feel: joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy at having someone to care for, someone who relied on him, someone who greeted him with a shy smile when he came home from work. Lyra was extraordinarily intelligent, even by Etherian standards. Torin had brought home some educational materials designed for human children, thinking they might keep her occupied, and she devoured them in days, then asked for more advanced content. Her grasp of Standard Galactic improved rapidly, and she began teaching him words in her native language, a melodious tongue that sounded like music when she spoke it. It was during one of these language lessons, on a quiet evening with rain pattering against the windows, that Lyra finally began to open up about her past. They were sitting at the small table Torin used for meals, working through a set of holographic flashcards he'd borrowed from the community library, when she suddenly set down the card she'd been holding. "Torin," she said, her accent now barely noticeable, "can I tell you something?" He immediately gave her his full attention. "Of course, you can tell me anything." Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers twisting together in a gesture of nervousness he'd come to recognize. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am." Torin felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "Okay, would you like to tell me now?" I'm not just some random Etherian," Lyra began, her violet eyes fixed on the table rather than meeting his gaze. "My family, they were important, very important." "Were?" Torin picked up on the past tense immediately. Lyra nodded, and he could see tears beginning to form. "There was an accident. We were traveling, my parents, my guardians, and me, on a diplomatic vessel. I don't remember all the details. I was younger, and I was asleep when it happened. But something went wrong with the ship. There was fire and smoke and people screaming." Torin reached across the table and gently took one of her hands in his. "You don't have to talk about this if it's too painful." But Lyra shook her head. I want to. I need to. You've been so kind to me, and you deserve to know the truth." She took another shaky breath before continuing. "I remember one of my guardians grabbing me and putting me in an escape pod. I was crying, asking for my mother, but they said there wasn't time. They said they'd find me, that I just needed to be brave for a little while. Then they sealed the pod and launched it." Tears were streaming down her face now, and Torin felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He squeezed her hand gently, offering what comfort he could. The pod drifted for, I don't know how long, days maybe. The emergency beacon must have failed because no one came. Eventually I crashed somewhere on Novara Prime. I don't remember the impact. When I woke up, I was in some kind of salvage yard. There were people there, but they didn't help me. They took the pod to sell it and left me there. "That's when you ended up in the shadow districts," Torin said quietly. Lyra nodded. "I was so confused and scared. I didn't know where I was or how to get home. I tried asking people for help, but most of them just ignored me. Some of them—" She trailed off, and Torin didn't push her to finish that thought. He could imagine what some of the less scrupulous residents of the lower levels might have tried to do with a lost alien child. "I survived by hiding and taking food where I could find it. I was there for weeks before you found me. I'd almost given up hope that anyone would help." Torin moved his chair around the table so he could sit next to her, and Lyra immediately leaned into him, seeking comfort. He wrapped an arm around her slight shoulders and let her cry, his own mind racing with the implications of what she'd told him. An accident involving a diplomatic vessel, Etherian officials, important enough to be traveling with guardians and staff, a child lost and presumed dead when the escape pod's beacon failed. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. "Lyra," he said gently, after her tears had subsided, "you said your family was very important. How important?" She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her violet eyes red-rimmed, but meeting his gaze directly. "My father is the Emperor of Ethel." For a moment, Torin couldn't breathe. The Emperor. He'd been harboring the daughter of the Etherian Emperor for 3 months. The Emperor who, according to every news report Torin had half paid attention to, was one of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. The Emperor whose daughter had been reported lost and presumed dead in a tragic accident nearly 8 months ago, sparking a period of mourning across Etherian space. "I know what you're thinking," Lyra said quickly, seeing the expression on his face. "You're wondering if you should contact the Etherian embassy, turn me over to them so I can go home." That's probably what I should do," Torin admitted. "Your father must be devastated. Your whole world is probably mourning. They deserve to know you're alive." "I've thought about that every day," Lyra said, her voice small but steady. "But I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I don't know if it was really an accident," she whispered. "I've been remembering more lately. Little things. Conversations I overheard but didn't understand at the time. My mother arguing with someone about trust and loyalty. My father looking worried when he thought no one was watching. And the way everything happened so fast during the incident, it felt wrong, like someone had planned it." Torin felt a chill run down his spine. "You think someone sabotaged your ship? Someone tried to—" "I don't know," Lyra said, her voice breaking. "I was so young. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. Maybe I'm just scared and making connections that aren't there. But what if I'm not? What if I go back and whoever did this tries again? What if by going back I put my father in danger?" It was a nightmare scenario, the kind of political intrigue that Torin had only encountered in entertainment vids. But looking at Lyra's frightened face, he couldn't dismiss her fears as childish imagination. Etherians were known for their complex political structures, and where there was power, there was always someone willing to do terrible things to claim it. "Okay," Torin said, making another decision that would alter the course of his life. "Then we won't contact them, not yet. Not until we know more and can be sure you'll be safe." Relief flooded Lyra's features. "Really? You'll help me?" "Of course I will," Torin said, pulling her into a proper hug. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Delay, As Lyra clung to him, her small arms wrapped tight around his chest, Torin stared at the rain-streaked window and wondered how a simple maintenance technician was supposed to navigate imperial politics and potential assassination plots. He had no connections, no resources beyond his meager salary, and no experience with anything more complicated than fixing broken ventilation systems. But he'd made a promise. And Torin Vasquez had never broken a promise in his life. Over the following weeks, Torin began his own careful investigation. He couldn't access high-level diplomatic databases without triggering security alerts, but he could review public news archives about the accident. What he found was troubling in its vagueness. The official report stated that the Imperial vessel had suffered a catastrophic systems failure, but the details were classified for security reasons. The passenger manifest had never been released, and the Emperor himself had made only one brief public statement, expressing his grief before retreating from public view. Torin also discovered that in the month since the accident, there had been significant political upheaval on Ethel. Several high-ranking officials had been replaced, trade agreements had been renegotiated, and there were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of factional conflicts within the imperial court. It painted a picture of instability, of a power structure in flux, exactly the kind of environment where a lost heir might be more useful as a memory than as a living, breathing claimant. He shared what he learned with Lyra, always careful to present the information objectively, letting her draw her own conclusions. She was far more politically astute than any child had a right to be, able to connect implications and read between the lines in ways that sometimes startled him. The administrator who replaced Lord Kethran was his rival for decades, she observed one evening, studying a news article on Torin's battered tablet. My father never trusted him. He said he smiled too much for someone with no joy in his heart. It was comments like these that reminded Torin of just how unusual Lyra's upbringing had been, how different from the childhood of a typical 8-year-old. She'd been raised in an imperial court, educated by the finest tutors, exposed to the complexities of governance and diplomacy from birth. Despite the trauma she'd endured, that foundation remained, shaping how she viewed and interpreted the world around her. As winter settled over Novara Prime, bringing with it storms that turned the shadow districts into flooded mazes and painted the upper city in frost, Torin and Lyra developed a comfortable routine. She continued her self-directed education, devouring information with an appetite that required Torin to make regular trips to the library for new materials. He taught her about human culture and history, about Earth and the various colonies scattered across the stars, and she taught him about Etherian philosophy, art, and the intricate social customs that governed her people. But always, underneath the domestic normalcy they'd created, was the question of what came next. Lyra couldn't hide forever. She was growing, developing, becoming more distinctly Etherian in ways that would be impossible to conceal as she matured, and Torin's resources were finite. He was already stretching his budget to its limits to provide for both of them. The decision was made for them on a cold evening in late winter, when Torin returned home from work to find Lyra waiting by the door, her face pale with distress. "Someone was here," she said before he could even remove his jacket. "While you were at work. They knocked on the door and called out, asking if anyone was home. They said they were from building management, doing inspections." Torin felt his blood run cold. Building inspections were routine, but they always gave notice. Always. Unless they were looking for something specific. "Did they see you?" he asked, already knowing the answer would determine their next move. "No, I hid in the ventilation access like you taught me. But Torin, they tried the door. If it hadn't been locked," she didn't need to finish the sentence. Torin pulled out his comm device and pulled up the building's management portal. There was no record of any scheduled inspection, which meant either it was a mistake, unlikely, or someone was specifically checking his apartment. Either way, their safe haven had been compromised. "Pack a bag," Torin said, his mind already racing through options. Just essentials. We need to leave. A leave? Where will we go? That was the question, wasn't it? Torin didn't have family on Novara Prime, didn't have friends close enough to impose on with a secret of this magnitude. But as he stood there, watching Lyra hurry to gather her few possessions, a memory surfaced. A conversation from years ago with a co-worker who'd moved on to a different job, who'd mentioned having connections with some kind of underground network that helped people who needed to disappear. At the time, Torin had dismissed it as exaggeration or bravado. Now it might be their only option. "I know someone who might be able to help," he said, projecting more confidence than he felt. "But we need to go now. Can you do that?" Lyra nodded, her jaw set with determination that reminded him of every story he'd heard about the iron will of Etherian royalty. "I'm ready." And as they slipped out of the apartment and into the labyrinthine corridors of the mid-level residential block, Torin cast one last look at the modest space that had been his home for 5 years. He'd thought, when he'd first moved in, that it would be temporary, that he'd eventually save enough to move to a better district, maybe even the upper levels. Instead, he was abandoning it in the middle of the night, his entire life reduced to a single bag slung over his shoulder and the alien child whose hand he held firmly in his own. The rain had started again, a cold drizzle that made the streets slick and treacherous. Torin led them through back alleys and maintenance corridors, paths he'd learned during his years working in the city's infrastructure. They moved quickly but carefully, alert for any sign they were being followed. Twice they had to hide, once when a security patrol passed uncomfortably close, and once when Torin spotted surveillance drones conducting a sweep of the lower commercial district. Each time, they pressed themselves into shadows and waited, barely breathing until the threat passed. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the industrial sector, where Torin hoped to find his old co-worker. His legs ached, his clothes were soaked through, and Lyra was shivering despite the thermal blanket he'd wrapped around her. But finally, they stood before a nondescript warehouse with no identifying markers, exactly as he'd remembered being described. Torin knocked on the side door, in the pattern he'd been told years ago, half expecting nothing to happen. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the door cracked open, revealing a sliver of a weathered face and one suspicious eye. "We need help," Torin said simply. "Please." The eye studied him, then dropped to Lyra, widening slightly at the sight of her iridescent skin and violet eyes. For a heart-stopping moment, Torin thought the door would slam shut, leaving them stranded and exposed. Instead, it opened wider, revealing a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and the kind of face that had seen too much of the galaxy's harsh realities. "Get inside," she said quickly. As they stepped into the warehouse, leaving the cold rain behind, Torin felt the weight of their decisions settle over him like a physical thing. They'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive hiding to active flight. There would be no going back to their quiet life in the mid-level apartment. No more pretending that they could simply wait out whatever storm was gathering around them. But as he looked down at Lyra, saw the trust in her eyes despite her fear, Torin knew he'd make the same choice again. Whatever came next, whether it was help or another obstacle, safety or danger, they would face it together. The woman sealed the door behind them and turned to study them properly, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said finally, "this is going to be interesting. Come on, we have a lot to talk about, and not much time to do it." As she led them deeper into the warehouse, past stacks of cargo containers and into a hidden interior space where other figures waited in the shadows, Torin felt the first chapter of their story closing and a new one beginning. The simple maintenance technician and the lost princess, bound together by circumstance and choice, stepping forward into an uncertain future. But whatever that future held, Torin vowed silently, he would protect Lyra. Not because of who her father was or what she represented politically, but because in the 3 months since he'd found her shivering in that alley, she'd become the most important person in his life. She wasn't a duty or a burden, she was family. And family, Torin had always believed, was worth any sacrifice. 2 years had passed since that rainy night when Torin and Lyra had fled into the unknown. The Underground Network, an organization calling themselves the Displaced, dedicated to protecting refugees and those fleeing persecution, had provided them with new identities, safe passage off Novara Prime, and eventually a home on a peaceful colony world at the edge of explored space. Torin worked as an engineering consultant now, his skills in demand on a frontier world still building its infrastructure. Lyra, now 10 years old in human terms, attended a small school where her Etherian heritage made her unique but not unwelcome. She'd grown taller, her features maturing, but she still had that same gentle spirit that had first touched Torin's heart. They'd built a life together, quiet and unremarkable to outside observers, but rich with the small joys that came from genuine connection. Torin had officially adopted Lyra through the colony's simplified legal system, making their bond recognized not just emotionally, but legally. She called him father now, easily and without hesitation, and the word still made his heart swell every time he heard it. But the galaxy, they'd learned, had a way of not letting go of its secrets forever. The message arrived on an otherwise ordinary morning, encrypted in a code only someone with Etherian ties could understand. Torin recognized the signature instantly. It was from the Emperor's court, a discreet but unmistakable summons. Lyra had not been forgotten. Her fate was once again at the center of a game far larger than either of them had anticipated. The message was simple yet heavy with implication. Return to Ethel. The time has come for the lost daughter to reclaim her place. Torin sat beside Lyra, watching as her violet eyes filled with 1,000 swirling emotions: hope, fear, determination. She was no longer the frightened child from the shadow districts, but a young girl ready to face whatever lay ahead. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Lyra nodded, gripping his hand tightly. "I am." Together, they prepared for the journey back to the Imperial world, carrying with them the strength of survival, the bond of chosen family, and a future rewritten by courage and hope.